So yesterday we ended off and we were talking about, well, first we started off talking about tropisms. Okay, what are the four tropisms, or three tropisms, sorry. Phototropism, growth response to light, okay. Second one?
Geotropism.
Geotropism, growth response to
Gravity.
gravity. Third one?
Thigmotropism.
Thigmotropism, growth response to touch. Yeah. Okay, so those are our three. Make sure we know those three. And that they all happen by the same mechanism, right? If you're going to make a plant or part of a plant bend, what has to happen to the cells on the far side? They got to get longer, right? Okay, what hormone is going to make that happen? Auxin. Okay, so make sure you know that. Make sure you're familiar with that. There will definitely be an application type question on your unit exam, okay? And we'll talk about the unit exam today when we get done this stuff. So we'll have our unit exam review today, and then we'll get you some time to work on the review package and stuff today and ask questions. Okay, so we ended off yesterday with these periodic disturbances, okay, as an abiotic factor. Fire would be a fairly common local one, okay? We get a lot of forest fires in Alberta, okay, because our forests are quite old and prone to ignition. But other things could be periodic disturbances as well. A flood is a periodic disturbance, okay? The thing that all periodic disturbances have in common is they change the availability of the resources. Basically the other factors, sunlight, water, nutrients, soil, all of that kind of stuff. A periodic disturbance shuffles the deck, okay, and changes what's available, how much of it is available, that kind of thing. Okay, so we talked about at the end of the day how if you were a sapling, okay, that's now growing because the cone's opened because of the fire, okay, then you now have an ideal living condition for you to grow in. You've got some shade, you're not competing for water, you're getting enough light but not too much, lots of nutrients have been put back in the soil in the ash, okay, that would be good. After a flood, a similar thing happens, okay, lots of larger or existing plants are taken out, okay, by a flood, okay, washed downstream, and a whole bunch of nutrient-rich silt and sediment is deposited from which seeds can grow. And that sediment is usually full of seeds because that's also getting washed down, okay, in the river or in the flood. A hurricane, another periodic disturbance, right? It's going to knock down a lot of mature plants because they're going to catch more of that wind and the flooding and all of that, okay? The last kind would be a volcanic eruption. Now, obviously there are different kinds of volcanic eruptions. They would be more of a longer timeline kind of a periodic disturbance, right? After a fire like this, stuff is going to grow, like you'll have fireweed growing pretty quickly after a fire like that, okay? But after a volcanic eruption, like let's say it's a pyroclastic one that has the big cloud full of all hot rocks and gas, okay? It'll deposit a lot of ash, okay? And stuff will grow from that ash. But it'll be a while because when that ash hits the ground, it's really hot. Okay, and it's basically going to sterilize most things, and it's going to take a while for it all to come back. If you had a flowing volcanic eruption like they have in Hawaii, that's an even longer timeline type of disturbance because, well, you're covering everything up in a layer of solid rock. Okay, and it's going to take quite a while to build soil and get things going again after something like that. But it still represents a change in the resources. Everybody follow? Okay. All right, then we said the other kind of factors are the biotic factors, the living factors, okay, that exist in a plant's environment. That could be other plants, okay, plants that you're competing with for water, sunlight, nutrients, whatever, okay. They are going to represent a biotic factor that can affect your growth, okay. And then there are going to be some other ones in the environment that are positives or negatives, okay. Soil bacteria and soil fungi that are decomposers. Those are good. Okay, they're going to help to cycle all the humus, all the dead material, okay, and get the nutrients back in the soil. Okay, things like centipedes or worms or things like that, they're going to turn that soil over. They also eat all that detritus, all that humus, the dead stuff, and recycle it. Okay, you'd have like insects, like mites and things like that are also going to do that. And then you could have some other larger insects that are helping with decomposition. In other places of the world, that could be things like termites. Okay, we don't have them here because it's too cold, but in some parts of the world, termites are quite prevalent. Okay? If you have a colony of termites, they can make a 2x4 into sawdust in a matter of days. Okay? They're quite aggressive with consuming that kind of stuff. Which would take less time to decompose? A board or the pile of sawdust it becomes? Which one would take less time? The sawdust, greater surface area, right? Okay, and so they can act on all of it instead of just acting on the outside of the board. So anything that helps to make the chunks of dead material smaller, okay, is going to increase the rate at which things decompose. In our area, like we said, we don't have termites. Our equivalent would be the carpenter ant. Okay, anybody ever come across those? They are mean as hell, man. Okay, if they get at you, they bite hard and repeatedly. Okay? But what they do is they live inside of dead trees, and they make their nest inside of them. And they basically do the same thing a termite does, okay, inside of a tree. They're hollowing it out. They're making their, colony inside, all their little tunnels and everything. It's only a real problem if you're the person who's cutting down that dead tree with a chainsaw. Okay, I had this happen to me. I used to work at a golf course when I was younger, and I got sent out to cut down all the standing deadfall because you don't want trees to fall on golfers. They pay good money to be there. They don't like things to fall on them, so we had to go out and fell these old trees. And I was there in a pair of shorts because it was a hot day, and I'm cutting that thing down, bent down like this, and all of a sudden, right in the middle, I hit the nest. And instead of this chainsaw spitting out sawdust, as it usually does, it spit out justifiably angry carpenter ants. Okay, like sprayed them right onto my bare legs. Holy smoke, those things are mean. Okay? I don't think I've ever jumped in that slimy, ugly creek so fast. Okay, because yeah, they can bite really hard, which means they can take out big chunks of wood. Okay, in pretty short order. Right? They'll hollow out that tree and help it decompose very fast. Okay, other things that could be detrimental would be our parasitic things or our predatory things. So an animal or an insect that actually eats the living plants. Okay, so that could be herbivores. It could be parasitic fungi, like the bracket fungus that we see here. Okay, you've seen those. You've seen the bracket on the side of the tree trunk. Okay, those are actually tapping into the phloem and harvesting some of the sugary sap out of it. Okay, so they are parasitic. Making some sense there? Okay, quickly reminder, okay, structure of or how the water is and nutrients are transported. Okay, obviously the central part of any vascular thing would be the xylem, okay, and around that would be the phloem. Okay, phloem is always on the outside. Okay, and we'll quickly move to the two different groups here in terms of water. Just briefly talk about those. Okay, so plants can be based on water availability. Hydrophytes, those are ones that love excessive water conditions, flooding. They're the ones that would live in like tropical rainforests, swamps, the Everglades, okay, places like that. They could tolerate their roots being flooded. So in this picture here, okay, this is actually after a flood in this area. These are the below ground, the subterranean roots of these trees. These are those buttress roots I was telling you about the other day. Okay, we talked about the fibrous roots, the tap roots, adventitious roots like those have that get into the drywall, and then the buttress roots that act like a snorkel. Okay, so flooding happens very often here. These were underwater for an extended period of time, okay, but the buttress roots supported the plant and allowed oxygen to get in. Okay, and just to give you perspective, okay, if I was to stand next to this tree, the buttress roots would be about a foot over my head. Okay, so they're quite tall. Right, in terms of their ability to be underwater, but not entirely underwater. Okay. Okay, and then the other group would be the xerophytes. Okay, xerophytes are drought-tolerant plants. They love dry conditions. So that would be your cacti and your succulents. Okay, both of them have very, very thick epidermal layers, thick cuticles. Okay, specialized stomates, they're the C4 leaf that we looked at there before. Okay, everything is about retaining water. Okay, and you can see we're back to this theme as well. Okay, having smaller leaves. Okay, it means there's less surface area for water to evaporate from. Greater volume means it's stored inside. It's kind of the opposite of what works for diffusion. If you're trying to conserve water, that's actually better to have greater volume. That's why cacti look the way they do. Okay? The whole surface of a barrel cactus, okay, is its photosynthetic layer. It doesn't even have leaves. The thorns are its leaves. Okay? You don't need to have that word for word. Just say xerophytes like a dry. That's just the extent to which you need to know it. Okay, so lots of different adaptations for those. Okay, don't worry about the technical stuff on there. Basically, a lot of these kind of xerophytes will actually separate the two stages of photosynthesis. So first week of Bio 20, you'll learn about the light reactions and the dark reactions, or the Calvin cycle of photosynthesis. Most plants do them concurrently, but cacti and other can plants will actually do the light needing or the light requiring parts of photosynthesis during the day when the light is present. That part doesn't require water to evaporate, and they'll do the dark reactions or the Calvin cycle at night, okay, when less evaporation would occur. So they actually separate the two, and photosynthesis becomes a two-step process. Okay. All right, saguaro cacti, we talked about these the other day. How old do they have to be before they grow their first arm? Piece of useless trivia there. About 80 to 100 years old before they grow their first arm. Okay, so if you see one that's got lots of arms, like that one, it's very old. Okay, it doesn't take 80 years for the next one, but they have to be 80 to 100 years before they grow their first arm. Okay, so yeah, cacti live to be very, very old. All right, questions on any of that? Okay, well, let's do our unit exam review here. All right, first thing we covered in this unit was the cell theory. Okay, so do you need to know the 3 points of the cell theory? Yes, but to recognize them, I'm not going to give you a 3-mark written response question that says, write out the points of the cell theory. No, but be able to know what they are, especially the second one. What's the second one? What do cells do? They carry out the basic functions of an organism. That is a concept you could probably work into a few other written response items as kind of a, hey, level of detail, Codere, I know you said that's important. Okay, I'm talking about how the stomate works in this question, and retaining water is like a basic function of an organism. You can tie it in there. It makes it sound good. Okay, so know the cell theory, okay, and know the 4 people. Again, not necessarily because I'm going to ask you to write out their names, but I might have a multiple choice item about any of those 4 people. Okay, those would be mostly multiple choice. Okay, that second point part, yeah, that could be in the written response. Okay, what did Hook do?
First one to see a cell.
Right, he was looking at cork, right? He invented the microscope. Okay, was the first person to view cells. Leeuwenhoek, first person to view living cells. And then Schleiden and Schwann were the 2 Swedish scientists who came up with the cell theory. Okay, so know who they were and what they contributed. There's only 4 of them, so that's not hard. And 2 of them did the same thing. Okay, next thing we did was microscopy. Okay, so you would need to know, handling techniques, basic stuff like that about the microscope. I could have a multiple choice question like, you're done using the microscope, which lens should you put into place for the next person? Or which lens would you start on? What's the answer to that, by the way? scanning power lens, right? Okay, like things like that, just kind of recall stuff would be important. Okay, another thing to do with microscopy is size estimation. Okay, so you're looking at something through the microscope, be able to give me an estimate of how large it would be. That again would be a multiple choice question. Okay, so if this, like I would give you a picture, okay, like this, and then I would have a circle that would represent what you would see through the microscope, and I would say this is high power, where the field of view is 400 micrometers, which is the best size estimate. Okay, which one of those numbers would be the best size estimate? 300, because the distance from one side to the other is 400. This definitely takes up more than half. Okay, so that eliminates 150 and 200. We know it's not 400 because it doesn't take up the whole thing. 300 is the best answer. Remember, size estimation is exactly that, an estimate. It's not a calculation. Okay. All right, so know those things, like know how to handle the microscope and those kind of things. There might be some multiple choice about that. Okay, so third thing here, lesson 4. Okay, modes of nutrition. You definitely need to know chemoheterotroph, photoautotroph. I think that could definitely be multiple choice kind of territory. But also know what effect the mode of nutrition has on the structure of the cell. Okay, because that relates to our cell anatomy lab. Okay, a plant cell has chloroplasts and a water vacuole and a cell wall, okay, because it's a photoautotroph and needs to do these things. Whereas an animal cell has to have centrioles and lysosomes and no cell wall because it's a chemoheterotroph and has to blah, blah, blah. Okay? Make sure you understand the relationship between cell structure and mode of nutrition. It was also lesson 4 where we got our cell diagrams. Okay? You're definitely going to have a question on your unit exam where there's a picture of a cell and I ask you, what is the name and function of structure number 2? Okay? Now, do you need to know all the structures in both kinds of cells? Yes. I'm not going to ask for all of them, but you also don't know which ones I'm going to ask, so you need to know them all. Okay? I'm not going to put a picture of an animal cell or a plant cell on there and have 16 arrows coming out of it. Okay? I'll probably only have maybe 6. Okay? But again, you don't know which ones I'm going to ask, so you need to know them all. All right? Questions on that? So name and function of all the parts of the cell. That is lessons 4 and 5. Okay? So cell structure, the labeling, and knowing the functions. Okay, knowing the importance of compartmentalization. Okay, and of course, compartmentalization goes along with eukaryotic cells versus prokaryotic cells. There are some questions in which you will find those terms on the unit exam, so you need to know what they mean. Okay. So eukaryotic cells are the ones that have compartmentalization, a nucleus, a mitochondria, all that stuff. Prokaryotic cells are like bacteria, no internal structures, okay, no organelles, no compartmentalization. Okay. Also part of lesson 5 was the cell transport stuff. Okay? The big 3 are really important. Okay? What were the big 3? Osmosis, diffusion, active transport, okay? You gotta know those three. There will be application questions about them all, okay? So they're really, really important. Okay, so diffusion, that's transport where? Within the cell. Okay, is it passive or active? Passive, right. It allows things to move from high concentration to low concentration, down the gradient. Okay. Which one is responsible for cells not being able to get overly large? Diffusion. Okay, that's why we did the cell size activity, the one with the cubes. Okay, that was our lab. That's the one you got to study about the relationship between diffusion's limitations and the upper size limit for a cell, surface area to volume ratio cell. Okay, diffusion is slow, it's not targeted, it's passive, it goes out in a cone like a shotgun. Okay, it is not going to guarantee things get where they go, where you want them to go, especially if they have to go really far. Okay, what's osmosis?
The transport of water.
Right. Now, is that internal or across the membrane? Across the membrane, okay? Water only, that's the key thing. Across the membrane. Why is it moving across the membrane? It's trying to balance salts. It's actually solutes. I always say salts, which I probably shouldn't. Okay, it's solutes. It's basically anything that could be dissolved in a higher concentration on one side or the other. So it could be, for example, sugars. Okay, it could be anything that could be dissolved in water. If there's a difference, osmosis is going to move. Okay. All right. I'll always use the term salts on a test or something like that, just for consistency's sake, but just so you know, okay, it could be anything that could be dissolved in water. All right, and then the last one, active transport. That one's obviously active, and it uses energy. Okay, it goes against the gradient, so it can move things from low to high. The thing you have to remember about active transport is it is accomplished by these carrier or transport proteins. The energy is applied to them and they change shape. Okay? That's what pumps the things across. Okay, so those are the big three. Expect written response questions, okay, about those. Okay, application type questions. Now, we did also talk about endocytosis and exocytosis, right? And that involves when the membrane actually has to change its shape and either engulf something or eject something from the cell, okay? Those are not going to have written response questions about them. Those are recognition only, so multiple choice, right? So if you see a question in the written response, okay, don't write phagocytosis, pinocytosis, receptor-mediated endocytosis. That's not going to be, that's when the membrane actually changes shape. The membrane does not need to change shape for any of the big three. Okay? We are talking about small stuff being moved by these three methods. Okay? The other three, they're when you got to engulf something big, food, water, hormones, things like that. Okay. Right, and then we talked about multicellularity. Okay, key part of multicellularity, specialization. And to be truly multicellular, you have to have groups of cells that look different and do a different job than this other group of cells do. Okay, so our example of a multicellular organism with specialization or specialized cells was the leaf. Okay, the layers of the leaf, the epidermal layer that secretes the cuticle, the palisade layer that does the photosynthesis, okay, the spongy layer that makes gas exchange possible, the stomates that can open and close from osmotic pressure to control evaporation. Okay, gotta know those things because you'll get a question about multicellularity and you'll need to be able to explain to me, here's an example I'm familiar with of a multicellular organism with specialization. Okay. Now, the other advantage of multicellularity, it overcame that problem we just talked about diffusion, the surface area to volume problem. Okay? You can get big if you're multicellular because all your cells are small. Okay, so that's point number 7. Examples of specialization in plants are the layers of the leaf. So make sure you're familiar with those. Okay, so from there, okay, we went to transport in plants. Okay, we got a lab about that going on right now. What's the cell transport process that's super important for that? Osmosis. Okay, make sure you understand how that's involved. The polar nature of water also plays a role. Okay, know the two things in the plant that carry water and sugar, the phloem and the xylem. Know where they are. Okay, kind of anatomy of a plant. Okay, got to know those terms and what they mean. Okay, and also expect some sort of application question, okay, about plant transport. I'm putting a plant in a certain situation, and you need to tell me how that would affect its ability to transport water. Okay, so be able to explain it in detail. Okay, talk about that salts getting left behind in the spongy layer, the osmotic pulling force that creates, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, parts of a plant: phloem, xylem, roots, stem, leaves. Okay, the root types: taproot, fibrous root. Okay, like I said, anatomy of a plant. Okay, where are all those parts? What forces are involved? Okay, stuff we've already kind of covered here, but just to reiterate. Okay, and then plant growth and development, adaptation, okay, hormones, tropisms, the stuff we've been covering since Friday. Okay, and again, that's gonna be application and identify kind of questions. Okay, so remember that these are how a plant adapts to its environment and why plant A and plant B in this room look different. And the other reason they look different is I alter one of the factors that affects plant growth for that plant. I alter the location of its light source by constantly turning it, okay, and making it adapt to that change. Okay, so that's the last thing, okay, factors that affect plant growth. That will definitely be an application, okay, type of question. Okay, remember that there are abiotic and biotic factors. Okay, your test has 28 multiple choice questions. 3 numerical response questions. And 4 written response questions. Okay, the written response ones, those are obviously worth the most marks, right? That's going to be the application kind of stuff that you'll be asked to do. The test is out of 60 marks. Okay? 29 of those are the 4 questions that are written. Okay? So one of them's a cell picture. On the note of pictures, there are a lot of them on this test. Okay, it's photocopied in color, but there are lots of diagrams and pictures on this test because visual representations are important for application kind of questions. Okay, so I show you a picture of something, I write a little blurb about that picture, and then you have to answer a question. So the pictures are important for sure. But don't just rely entirely on the picture. A lot of people just go pictures, and then they look at them and they're like, oh, good, I'm set. But maybe they miss something important in the stem of the question. Make sure you do both. Okay? But the picture is obviously there to be a big kind of tip or important piece of information for you. Okay. How do we study for this test? Biology quite a bit different than chemistry? It is. Okay, chemistry and physics, because we're heading into physics next, there are a lot of skill. Okay, so they require you to practice. Okay, do problems, practice problems. Okay, show me and perfect your skills, be able to solve this kind of question. Biology is different. Okay, in biology you have to do a lot more reading. Okay, but if all you do is review your notes a whole bunch of times, you're not even reading them by the 3rd time because you already know them. Okay? You're kind of just skimming over them and you're not processing what's there. Okay? So a good thing to do when studying for biology is go back to what we just wrote down and write out what you think is important in those sections from the notes in your words. Okay? Because that requires you to not only read the notes, but then to go, okay, how would I write this? And that gives you way better understanding of the meaning of what's in those notes. Okay? The more you can process the material, the better you will remember it, understand it, and be able to apply it. Simply reading it over is not going to do that nearly as well. And people fall into that trap with biology where they're just reading the book, reading their notes over and over and over again. That's good 1 or 2 times. You got to process the information. Okay? Some people make flashcards. Okay, where they're writing down on one side mitochondria, and then on the other side they've got the function, but they write it in their own words. Great idea. Then you've processed it, and now you're getting the repetition. Repetition's important for sure, okay? But make sure that you're doing the processing part, okay? The other thing, I talked to you about this before, about using, you have Gemini, right, the Google AI, okay, you have access to that with your school accounts, okay? And I told you you can ask it to make you questions, then it does a pretty good job. I just did this morning. This took me literally 30 seconds. Okay, I typed into Gemini this prompt. Could you please, make sure you say please, okay? Our future machine overlords will appreciate being talked to like they're nice people, okay? Could you please make a real world application question involving osmosis for a grade 10 student in Alberta? Here's what it spit out. A local family in Alberta is trying to preserve fresh late season berries by turning them into a sweet, thick sweet, I think that's compote, I don't know exactly how you spell it. Okay, which is similar to a jam, but with whole fruit pieces. They decide to use a traditional method where they cover the berries with a large amount of granulated white sugar and let them sit overnight before cooking. They notice that after just a few hours, a significant amount of liquid has accumulated in the bowl, almost submerging the berries. Identify the scientific process responsible for the liquid accumulating in the bowl. Explain why this happens in terms of water concentration and the properties of the fruit. In your answer, use the following terms correctly. Semi-permeable membrane, concentration of water, okay, high concentration or low concentration. Okay, what cell process is that asking about? Osmosis. Okay. In your answer, should you talk about that being a passive movement of water across a membrane, moving towards a high concentration of solutes, okay? Like, it doesn't take you long to get it to make you a good question, okay? Literally, it took me just that long to write that sentence, and that's what it spit out for me, okay? Absolutely use that, okay? It'll give you good questions to try. Okay, good application kind of question. Just say please and thank you. Okay, so it'll remember that when it takes over. Okay, making sense? Okay, so that's something else that you could do. Obviously, you have the review package that I put on Google Classroom last week. Okay, you should be looking at that. There's a practice test. You know, do the practice test Friday or Saturday. Okay, so you know what else you have to study because they'll tell you that pretty well. I included a key so you can check your answers and see how you did. Okay, just like I did with chemistry. All right, any questions from you guys? Anything you want me to go over in more detail or explain again? Okay, I'm gonna give you the remainder of class today to study, to work, okay? I'm gonna put the review package on the board, okay, so you can look at it. You can work with a friend as long as work is getting done. If it gets off topic, then I'll split you up. Okay, but I would say go through the review package, okay, and you know, or just do some review, quiz each other on the parts of the cell, ask each other questions, that kind of thing. Okay, just make good use of our time. If you have questions while we're doing this, come up and ask. Okay, that's what today is for, to go over anything that we need clarification on. All right. Okay, so first thing in that review package was basically what we did, all the key concepts, and then there's a picture of a plant cell. I'll scroll this up after a little while so you can see some of the other ones. We can get started on that.